Hi, this is Chris Colvin. I'm the founder of In the House. We're a community to empower in-house counsel to succeed in their professional lives and to become thought leaders within the legal industry. At In the House, we think in-house lawyers are extremely important, both to the legal profession and to the larger business world. And that's why our mission is all about empowerment. We empower through meetings like this at our various working groups, as well as different conferences and educational opportunities that we provide for in-house counsel. I'm easy to reach. Anyone who wants to reach me can just email me at chris@inthehouse.org. But without further ado, let's get started with today's session of our Cybersecurity and Privacy Working Group. I'm here with David Heckler, who is our co-chair of our working group. He's also the editor-in-chief of Cyber Insecurity News, who sponsors this working group and who we partner with to provide really amazing guests like the one we have for you today. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to David, and David will tell you guys all about our guests today.
Actually, thank you, Chris. David here. We have a little video to introduce Roy Hadley. Roy and I did an interview with Roy that's now on our website, www.cyberinsecuritynews.com. And Roy and I spent a few minutes doing this new video series that I've begun called The Nugget, which is just kind of a nugget from the interview, a nugget from my conversation with him that kind of is particularly valuable information for in-house lawyers. Chris,
should I roll it?
Let's see if this works.
Are you going to try to do it yourself? Okay.
I can't, because you said you queued it and you said you were the one who had to do this.
I will roll it. Here we go. You ready?
Okay. I'm ready. Let's see what happens. Hello. Welcome to The Nugget, which offers in-house lawyers and those who work with them 2 minutes of advice and information from experts on cybersecurity. And today we have Roy Hadley Jr., who is a special counsel at Adams and Reese. And almost exactly 1 year ago, well, certainly 1 year ago this month, got a phone call from the city of Atlanta, with whom he'd worked with some of the people there. And it was on the day they suffered one of the largest ransomware attacks in U.S. history. Now, I'm going to ask Roy to talk a little bit about what prepared him for this kind of assignment. He's a lawyer, but he's also functioned as a chief privacy officer, and he is now, as I said, an outside lawyer, but he has also worked in-house. How did that entire background give you the confidence to take on a really daunting assignment that day?
Thanks, David. Great to be here speaking with you today. As you said, I was in-house for a long time in my career. I was general counsel of a couple of companies, chief privacy officer of a company. And, that just really helped me when I got that call that you mentioned from the city of Atlanta. As you know, the city suffered that ransomware attack, but what that in-house experience at the highest levels helped me to do was to go into that situation and to go into other situations with other clients and really help in terms of giving practical advice. I have a very good understanding of the way organizations work. I have a very good understanding of how organizations have to prioritize. Budgets aren't absolute. You have $1 million, you can spend it here, you can spend it there. Those are the things that in-house counsel, general counsels have to deal with on a daily basis. And my experience has really helped me to have those conversations with in-house lawyers and quite frankly, others in the organizations. Because one thing that you always have to remember as outside counsel is that your job is to help them, in-house lawyers, in-house counsel, to make the best decisions that they can for their companies. A lot of times I will give the advice to say, hey, look, you have to remember what we're doing here is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And because of that, we're constantly reevaluating what we're doing. We're constantly testing, probing, asking questions to come up with the best solution then, tomorrow, the next day, and so on. And that in-house experience has really helped me to be in a position to help my clients because I get it. I understand. I've been in that seat. And so that's the best, thing about having that past in-house experience.
Great. Thank you. So that's it for today's installment of The Nugget. I'm David Heckler, Editor-in-Chief of Cyber and Security News. And I'd like to thank Roy Hadley Jr., our guest. And if you'd like to learn more about Roy's experience dealing with that's ransomware attack in Atlanta, go to www.cyberinsecuritynews.com and you'll see a lengthy interview that we feature with Roy right up there on our website. So until the next installment of The Nugget, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Back to you, David.
I don't see all the, oh, I know. Okay, never mind. Okay, it looks like we have quite a few people here now.
Yep.
Sorry. That was the, Roy, you did great. I need a little work, but I'm going to get there. I know I'm going to get there next time. Anyway, it's always a pleasure seeing yourself on video, especially, never mind. So why don't we just start out talking about, why don't you give us a few minutes talking about what it was like to all of a sudden find yourself, without warning, in the middle of this really major episode in Atlanta. You got the phone call, you dropped everything. What happened?
Right. So, pleasure to be here. I appreciate everyone taking time out of your day to join us here. And so, first off, just thank you to everyone. That day, and we're coming up on a year now from that day back last March, where I literally was sitting in my office and I got a call from a lawyer down there who said, we've got a ransomware attack and things are going on, and I'm going in to talk to the city attorney and tell him to call you. And I said, well, do that. I'll shoot you my bio. Literally 2 minutes later, I get a call from the city attorney, who's the equivalent of a general counsel. And he said, when can you be down here? And my response was, I'm on my way. And, I spent, I think, about 16 hours down at the city that day. And for the next couple of weeks, probably 15 to 18 hours a day down at the city. It's one of those things where the city suffered what was and probably still is the largest ransomware attack, definitely on a municipality in a major city or state in the United States. And the biggest thing was we didn't know what was going on. And in hindsight, we can look back and say, oh, it was a ransomware attack and, we did this and we did that. But at that time, we didn't know what was going on. So when we went into that room and, started kind of activating the city's emergency plan, and we'll talk about that later, the necessity for having one of those at your organization, we started implementing that, but we did not know what was going on. So we started calling vendor, security help to get down, forensic help, the 3-letter agencies, all of those came on board very quickly to try to figure out what was going on. Because the first thing that I always tell people is stop the hemorrhaging, figure out what's going on, stop the hemorrhaging. So we didn't know whether it was a ransomware attack. We had some indications because of, the screens that were on people's computers, but we didn't know whether data was being exfiltrated, whether personal information was being, siphoned off into the internet. We had no idea what was going on. So the biggest thing initially was to, as best we can, kind of triage the situation, figure out what's going on and stop the hemorrhaging. Once you stop stop the hemorrhaging, you can then start to say, okay, what do we need to do to start recovering? What do we need to start putting in place to kind of get back to where we need to be? But that was the main thing, David. You just didn't know what was going on, and in a lot of cases, that's what happens. And so you get these calls, you know something is wrong. You know, people can't turn on their computers. People can't, log in. Their phones aren't working into the network. All of those sorts of things are going on, but you just don't know at that time what's going on. So that's the main thing. You know, it's just the wild, wild west and a big unknown when you first get that call.
So you spent a lot of time working with the in-house lawyers there. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what their roles were. They had a fairly large department in the city of Atlanta. How did you coordinate with them, and how did they coordinate with their company? With the municipality.
With the city. So,
right.
Like a lot of big organizations, the city has a very big legal department. But, that legal department is spread out over a lot of different functionalities. So you have lawyers that deal with the courts. You have lawyers that deal with public works. You have lawyers that deal with, police. And so you've got a lot of different functionalities there. But what we had to do really was bring a lot of those functionalities to bear. So under the oversight of the city attorney, I came in and really started trying to help marshal those resources. We knew that we were going to, for example, have to procure services from outside vendors, equipment from outside vendors to help identify what was going on initially. But then as we began to get into the recovery phase of kind of the plan, we had to bring in, procurement because the city, like most municipalities, you typically just can't go out and buy something. There's a process for procuring. In this case, we were able to avail ourselves of the emergency procurement processes that the city of Atlanta had. But even that, you're drafting legislation to go before the city council. You are reviewing contracts with these vendors real time. And so you really have to bring in a lot of different disciplines. And so one of my jobs was to try to help to coordinate all of those, because when these things are going on, one of the biggest things that people ought to think about, and lawyers, particularly in-house lawyers, are the quarterback of communication. And that's making sure that everybody is communicating with everybody that they need to, making sure that everybody is on the same page, making sure that everybody has the best and latest information. And the lawyer is in a unique position to kind of be that quarterback and make sure it's all going on. As outside counsel, one of the things that having me or someone like me does is it also gives you kind of a veil, let's just say, and veil may not be the right word because it makes it seem like you're trying to hide something, but it gives you kind of that overlay of attorney-client privilege so that you can have more robust and more matter-of-fact conversations about what's going on and have some semblance of attorney-client privilege to keep it private and keep it secure as you begin to kind of implement your plan and to try to, quite frankly, recover from whatever kind of attack it is. So, the in-house lawyer role, I mean, we had probably, I would say, at any given time, 10 plus City of Atlanta lawyers working on this thing, sometimes more, depending upon various roles. One of the things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is we had to implement manual processes for the court system because the computer system that the courts use to get from all the way from ticketing with an officer to adjudication was down. And so we had to have lawyers, go in and help to draft and implement a paper process until a manual paper process until we could get, the computer system stood back up. So again, the role of lawyers in these types of things is critical in terms of making sure the functionality is there. but it's also critical in terms of quarterbacking, making sure that everybody's talking to everybody, because that's where you can get into trouble pretty quickly in a response if people are working off of bad or stale information.
Couple things we should say now, just for the background of our participants here. The Mayor Bottoms, early on, as Roy explained, said two things. She said, we're not paying ransomware, period, and we're going to be as transparent as we can about the process, which is one of the reasons why Roy is able to say as much as he is and why we know as much as we do. Now, we have one comment from Duncan McAllen, who's muted right now. So, Duncan, if you want to talk a little bit about what you said, you'll have to unmute yourself. But he said, I'm here as a member of the CERT for the city. And are you talking about the city of New York, the city of Atlanta?
City of Atlanta. I was part of the CERT response team for the ransomware outbreak immediately following the events. So I'm here, not only just to kind of gain insights from the legal perspective, but also as a checks and balances and making sure that, certain information about the attack isn't disclosed. But I have to give, props where it's due. The gentleman just speaking, forgive me, I don't see your name on screen, only your handle. But you emphasize so clearly the necessity for these organizations today to actually have a cyber incident response planning take place prior to any type of attack, right? And it does need to include legal and compliance, HR, your IT and IS teams. Everybody needs to have a voice and a role in that cybersecurity incident response planning. But, whoever the executives are, the executive sponsors, whether if it is a city mayor or a CEO or a board of directors, they need to have sign off and full awareness and approval of that incident response plan. And the first time they see it, folks, should not be when it's having to be implemented. Right.
Yeah. You don't want to know how you're going to react to bullets as the bullets start flying by your head.
Right.
And I think, Duncan brought up an excellent point. And, one of the things that you want to look for in your organization is an incident response plan that has been vetted by the appropriate sponsors, approved, and that everybody's on board. One of the things that I see a lot of times in organizations is that they have an incident response plan, but have never taken it off the shelf. And so and matter of fact, I even saw one time where they had an incident response plan. Everybody had it on their computers. Guess what? Computers went down. Right. And and so nobody was able to dust it off. Let's just say. So best practice, have it written and printed and on your. But the other great point that Duncan brought up is that incident response plan has to be multidisciplinary. So every stakeholder has to be involved. That's legal, that's finance, that's the administration, that's in the case of a municipality, that's public safety, that's public works. Atlanta had like most municipalities delivers water services, sewer services, 311, which was kind of the kind of help desk for citizens. If you have a problem, call 311 and they'll get you to the right place. Court system, the municipal court system comes under the auspices of the city. And so, when you start talking about that incident response plan, all of those stakeholders need to be at the table when you're developing it. All of those stakeholders need to be at the table when you are practicing it, when you're having tabletop exercises.
Right.
Are saying, kind of figuring out what would we do if we have a problem. And what I'll tell you is, no matter what you think and no matter how prepared you think you are, when you start talking about your incident response plan, again, when the bullets are flying, that's really when you learn a lot about yourself, your organization. And when you look at a lot of organizations, like if you look at the city of Atlanta, a lot of times people want to point to, oh my goodness, what went wrong? But what I will say in the city's case, because of its incident response plan, emergency preparedness, on the front end, in responding to this thing, a lot went right. In terms of how the city to respond and how the city was able to recover from this ransomware attack. And we have to remember, this was a criminal attack against the city.
Let me just say here that your comments, questions are welcome. We always want to hear you speaking directly to us, but if you prefer to enter a question in the chat window, all you got to do is take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen and click on chat and type your question. But please don't be shy. Whatever you want to know, feel free to ask or add a comment.
And let me just jump in here for a moment. I just want to mention, since we sort of jumped right into the discussion, rather than going through Roy's background, our guest is, someone had asked, so it's Roy Hadley Jr., and he's counsel at Adams and Reese, and I provided his profile in the chat window, so please click on that and pull that up in another window so you know who our speaker is. We only briefly touched on his background.
My apologies, Roy.
Hey, that's okay. Hey, I know where you live.
No, you don't. I wasn't in the city. They had to bring me in from Houston.
I know these things.
So while other people are warming up and getting their questions prepared, because I know they are, I had a question just about the nuts and bolts of it. I think when I hear ransomware, maybe I'm showing my age, but I'm thinking like the Lindbergh baby. You get this ransom note. How did the quote-unquote ransom note appear in this case? Who did it come? What did you know about who it came from, and what did they say? I'm just curious a bit about the details.
So it was the SamSam variant of ransomware, and that's been widely reported by the Justice Department, who indicted 2 Iranian nationals for the attack. So it was a SamSam variant, which was kind of a generally known variant of the attack. What happens with that particular variant is you will get a picture on a screen that basically says, your computer's been locked, click here, pay your Bitcoin within a certain amount of time, and you'll get the decryption keys to unlock your data. Nothing gee whiz, wham, bam, just a typical kind of ransomware screen. Unfortunately, for good or for bad, the media reported, somebody sent a screenshot of that to the media. They put it out there. And at some point before the expiration of the 7-day period, the went down, and so you really couldn't pay the ransom. But as you said earlier, the mayor came out, Mayor Bottoms, who provided tremendous leadership in this incident early in her administration, I might add, said, look, we're just not going to pay it. We're not going to reward criminality. And, she made that determination pretty quickly. One thing that I will say is we work very closely with Homeland Security, FBI, and a lot of other federal agencies who came on board and provided tremendous support early on, including the Justice Department. So a lot of what we did, not only were we trying to respond and recover, but we were also, because it was a criminal attack and an active criminal investigation, preserving evidence, making sure that we were doing the things that we could do and should do in order to make sure that at the appropriate time, federal officials could bring charges against these conspirators. So, it was again, a multi-pronged effort. And I think one takeaway for everybody on this call should be, as part of your incident response plan, get the federal agencies involved. Talk to them, the FBI, who typically leads, these types of investigations. Get to know who your field agent is for your locale or locales, because the first time you want to talk to them, it's not when something is happening. You want to have those relationships. You want to know who to call, and because they can be very helpful early on in terms of bringing resources to the table, in terms of providing intelligence, intel as to who the possible perpetrators are, what you're dealing with from a virus variant standpoint. So there's a lot of information that can be gleaned and learned from federal partners. And so one thing I would say is know who they are beforehand, and because you don't want to have to call, look in the phone book to try to figure out who you need to be calling.
I'll throw in a question. So Roy, two questions.
Yes.
One is, how much specifically was the demand, and what are some of the pros and cons of actually paying a ransom under these conditions?
The demand, again, as reported by the Justice Department in their indictment, was $40,000. And, a lot of times people say, well, should you pay, should you not pay? Early on, in kind of stepping back from the city's incident, but just in general, early on you saw, and I'm using air quotes here, kind of a professionalism when you start talking about these types of attackers. And that professionalism said, if you pay the ransom, we are going to, send you the key or keys to release your data. And so, it was kind of a given. If you sent it, the ransom, paid it in Bitcoin, they would release your data. What is transpiring now is that you're getting a lot more attackers out there who, you can buy these toolkits, these ransomware toolkits online on the dark web. And so you're starting to see a lot more people out there, bad actors who are perpetrating this type of attack. And, they don't have that professionalism around them. And so sometimes you get your data back and sometimes you don't. And so you always have to take that into account of, if we pay this data, this ransom, this Bitcoin, we still may not get our data back. Or, let's just say, and I'm making up a number, it's $100,000 and you pay the $100,000, they may send you the keys that unlock half of your data and say, okay, well, we know you pay, we know you're going to pay. So if you want the other half of your data, it's another $100,000. So again, you're dealing with criminals here. And so you're taking the word of a criminal that if you pay this ransom, you'll get your data back. Just like if somebody kidnapped a loved one, if you pay this ransom, you'll get your child back. You may or you may not. And you just have to take that into account. One other thing that people have to remember is that a lot of times it may not be just one key. It may be, many keys to unlock the data. Some work, some don't. So it's not a given that if you pay the ransom, you will get your data back. But it's a decision that each organization has to make, and a lot of times make on the fly. Do you have great backups? Is your plan in place that allows you to immediately go to your backups that have not been encrypted and be able to restore those? But even then, you still have to make sure paying the ransom is not this holy grail, so to speak, because they got into your system somehow. And what you don't want to do is not get the gates around the city and put the walls up around the city, and I'm using city euphemistically, around your little city, because if you don't make sure that you've protected the exterior and an attack can't happen again, so what you see a lot of times now is an initial ransomware attack. You pay the ransom, your data's unencrypted, unlocked, but then they come right back to you a day or two or a week later and encrypt it again and demand a further ransom. So paying the ransom in and of itself is not, the end of it all. You still have to do a lot of heavy lifting to understand what happened, how it happened, and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And some would say you probably need to do that before you pay the ransom. I know,
Duncan,
and I'll go one further. Here in Georgia, just this week, it was reported that a county, Jackson County, subject to a ransomware attack, and they paid the $400,000 ransom because I believe they determined that they didn't have the resources to not pay the ransom and then, kind of rebuild their systems. I don't know if they had adequate backups or what, but their whole government structure was down, including their public safety. And so they made the determination to pay the ransom and, get the keys and get their data back. As far as I understand, they did, in fact, get the right keys and their data was restored to them and their systems. But again, that's just not a given. And the FBI and other federal agencies will underscore that to you when they're talking to you about whether you pay the ransom or not.
Now, Roy, to quickly follow up on that, to your knowledge, does Jackson County now have a big target on its back for all the bad ransomware actors out there?
Yeah, yes, because somehow the initial perpetrators were able to infiltrate their systems and, lock them up and demand this ransom. Now everybody knows they will pay. And so hopefully Jackson County, before they paid or shortly thereafter, took some steps to harden their networks and harden their systems so that however this happened, it can't happen again. And, one of the things that you see a lot of times with these variants is not only do they lock up the systems, but they actively search for your backups. And, so that they can lock up your backups to eliminate your ability to just go to backups and restore. So a lot of these variants these viruses are very sophisticated and quite insidious in how they, attack your networks and attack your data. And so you just have to be mindful of all of those things. And, one other best practice that I'll throw out there is you have backups, but you need to make sure that you're doing the appropriate scans and virus scans and protections on your backups. And also every now and then check your backups, restore them, and see in fact that they are restorable, because I've had clients where to their backups and their backups weren't restorable. They hadn't been, properly backed up. And so you always have to worry about those sorts of things and think about them when you start talking about part of your response and resilience plan.
And Roy, I'd go one step further, and I'm a little bit more harsh when it comes to this, but I would advise those that are legal counsel here to advise your corporations or your clients, if you're not going to frequently test your backups, don't even bother taking them.
Right.
It's the reality of the situation. Now, Roy, I do have a question for you. Now, you already stole my thunder with the Jackson County. I was going to ask you about that because I was really put off. I'm one of those that gets offended when I see government agencies actually reward these criminals for their malicious behavior, and that's what we saw take place with Jackson County. However, they did their reality gut check and determined that they were not capable of restoring their systems. They did not have the security controls and the backups in place to be able to do so. So they weighed the pros and cons, and like you said, they paid the $400K in ransom. In contrast, we have City of Atlanta, who had a very minuscule $40K ransomware demand. And it's now public knowledge that their original estimate of 2.6 million rose to 17 million in order to fully recover from that incident. Right. So,
well, I'm saying right, but I'm saying right in the sense of I'm acknowledging what you're saying, not necessarily agreeing with you.
Right. I fully supported Mayor Bottom's stance that we are not going to do this. We will suffer our own consequences as a result, but we're not going to pay this ransom. What is your typical legal guidance towards any entity, whether if it's a municipality, government agency, or corporation, about cyber insurance?
Right. What I would say, and that's a great question. The city, just so everybody understands and kind of has a background, had a cyber insurance policy in place prior to this attack. And so, right now we're working with the insurance companies to recover under those policies. What I would say, from a legal standpoint is you should have cyber insurance. Because the reality nowadays is that incidents happen, things happen. And the other great thing about cyber policies that most people don't think about is that as the cyber insurance market matures, and I'm not saying it's anywhere near mature, as it gets older and more robust is probably a better way to put it, insurance companies are now starting to get their hands around understanding what those risks are, but they're also starting to help and have things in place, programs and best practices and things to help the insured make sure that they are as resilient as possible. Just like when you get employment liability insurance, employment practices, they come out and they have HR training and all those sorts of things. You're starting to see that for cyber insurance also. Many of these tools are no cost and are just available to policyholders. Some are at de minimis cost. But the goal of the insurance company is to make you as best a risk as they can. And so one of the things, again, that people just don't think about when they start talking about cyber insurance policies is the things on the front end that insurance company and that policy and the tools and resources can be brought to bear can do to help that enterprise, whether it's a government entity or whether it is a corporate entity, be more resilient, really to understand your risk, understand best practices, and what it is you should be doing in order to make your networks and systems and all of that more secure. In addition to your people, one of the things that these policies now are sometimes mandating, but are providing tools for is human training, because still one of the biggest vectors into your networks are people, whether it's spear phishing, just normal phishing, those types of things are getting more sophisticated. And unless your people are trained in those areas, you're going to have problems no matter what kind of technical solutions you put in place. So one of the things that those policies do avail to, the policy holders is that kind of training, human resource training, in addition to assessment. So cyber insurance is more than just insurance should something happen. It's, help on the front end to make you more aware of the threats, keep you up to speed around what the best practices are. And then again, heaven forbid something happens, to help you recover from those incidents. So it absolutely, in my opinion at this point, a best practice to have some sort of cyber insurance policy in place. I will say that most policies now are standalone policies. It used to be early in the process that a lot of these policies were endorsements or riders to existing liability policies. Now, cyber policies are pretty much standalone policies.
I'll just mention that the chat window shows that Duncan added one suggestion, which is to consider joining your local FBI InfraGard chat.
Absolutely.
That seems like a good suggestion. Since you brought up training, I know you've, especially since Atlanta, but even before, have led tabletop exercises at corporations. How effective do you think those are, and how important do you think those are as part of a cybersecurity program?
I think they're critically important. Again, we were talking about the incident response plan, but if it's just a book or something, a notebook that sits on your shelf, or heaven forbid is just on your computer on a file, it's really not much good unless you prepare and train for it and all of those sorts of things. It's kind of like I equate it to a football team. My kids accuse me of using analogies all the time. They say my life is an analogy. It's kind of like a football team. You have a playbook, but unless you actually get on the field and practice those plays before the game, what do you really have? And so I equate tabletops as kind of the practice of that playbook, the practice of that incident response plan that you have sitting on the shelf. And so in a perfect world, you could do it twice a year. In a less perfect world, maybe once a year, but you need to do them, I think is the takeaway here, because it gets people in a room. It gets people to know who the players are. And more importantly, it gets people to think about this thing, to think about security, to think about what would I do if this happened? Because again, you don't want the first time you look at that incident response plan to be when something actually happened. Right. And I think people don't really understand that. So I think it's critical to do the tabletops. And, sometimes, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll send out a scenario to people. Here's the scenario that we're going to do and talk about kind of an incident. But then once we get in there and actually start working through the tabletop exercise, we will introduce something else happens. We'll introduce, okay, you were relying on cell phones, but somehow your cell phone went dead. What are you going to do now? And so we have these interjections into these tabletops to again, make people think, think about what it is they're trying to do big picture, think about who the players are, understand how they need to be communicating with each other, to ultimately, kind of respond to whatever type of incident this is. So, I always say tabletops are fantastic. They're necessary, but when we do them, they're not static either.
Right. And Roy, if I can build on that for just a second, one of the other great things about running through these war room exercises or tabletop exercises is that it's going to open your mind and your eyes to some of the elements that you may have been missing. And Roy hit on a really good point earlier about having these incident response plans sitting on a laptop somewhere, and guess what? That laptop just got encrypted with Samsung, right? So part of what you're going to find is the things that you're going to potentially need day one, hour one, minute one of some type of cyber incident. I always recommend to organizations that they have jump bags inside of their companies where they're going to have pens, papers, portable printers, portable scanners. Hey, Roy, you remember those little handmade badges that we had with incident response team?
Right. I still have mine.
I do too. It's in my bag as a badge of honor.
Right.
But the whole purpose for that is that, security could not identify people coming into the building. And that's one of the things that gets thought through in these exercises. So what's going to have to be inside of that jump bag if all of your environment goes toes up and you have nothing at all to work from. And that should probably be the basis of your very first tabletop exercise. We've had a catastrophic disaster. Mm-hmm. What do we do to recover from it? Maybe it's not a cyber incident, but that will start to get you prepared for having a lights out situation.
Right. And you brought up an excellent point, Duncan, because, a lot of times people think of cyber incidents as attacks and a ransomware or whatever. And a lot of times they are, but a lot of times cyber incidents can also be a part of a bigger incident, a natural disaster, a tornado hits, your building or your enterprise and your backups are down and, all of those sorts of things and the power's out. And so you can't communicate with your computers. What are you going to do? Do people have laptops that they can use? Do you have Surface Pros, or, I hate to call brand names, but, do you have tablets that you can give to people so that they can, communicate and perform their job functionalities? Those are the kinds of things that you need to think about beforehand and put in place beforehand, similar to how FEMA, pre-positions water and blankets and blue tarps and all of that around the country should a natural disaster happen. As Duncan said, you need to be thinking about pre-positioning response tools within your organization should something happen, whether it's a pure cyber attack or whether it's a cyber problem because of a bigger issue, a natural disaster, a flood or a hurricane or something like that. So,
let me just give a 10.
To get in together.
Sorry, I just want to jump in and give a 10-minute warning because we're
Okay.
close to the top of the hour, so we should get any last-minute questions. I had one question, if you have time, Roy, which is,
Absolutely.
to what extent can putting some of your backups in the cloud provide protection versus having local backups? I think it was Duncan who mentioned, or either you or Duncan had mentioned, that your backups can sometimes be subject to a ransomware attack. What about the cloud? Does that help, and is that an option that would benefit companies and others?
It can help. What I always tell people is no one thing is going to be this panacea. It's not going to be perfect in and of itself. So cloud is good. The cloud can be helpful. But it needs to be a part of your overall plan. So, just throwing your stuff to the cloud, unless you have an overall plan that you're implementing around data security, data privacy, is going to be a half step and not really a full step. And so, yes, cloud can be very helpful as part of a master plan, but things can happen in the cloud. So you have to do your due diligence, even if that's part of your plan. And I tell the story of once I got a call from a client, and his company had put their data into the cloud, and they really hadn't done their due diligence on the cloud vendor that they were using. And he called me one day. He said, "Yeah, Roy, I was logging in to our account, and I got into the files of another company, and they were pretty sensitive. It was employment data and all of that." And so his question to me was, well, what should I do? Should I call the other company and tell them, I saw some of this sensitive information and blah, blah, blah. And as he was talking to me, I flipped it back to him. I said, well, now, I'll just say John, if you logged in and you were able to get somebody else's data with your cloud provider here, what if somebody else logged in and, you could see the light bulbs going off in his head? Because if you can see somebody else's, odds are somebody can see yours. Right. And, again, even with cloud providers, you have to do your due diligence. You have to understand their backup strategies. You have to understand their cybersecurity strategies. And that kind of transitions me to something I do want to make sure everybody thinks about. And that is, you've got to make sure that your vendors have adequate cybersecurity policies in place. If your vendors don't, you're only as strong as the weakest link in your program. And so if your vendors don't have adequate cybersecurity policies, if they're not doing background checks on their employees regularly, if they're not, checking their vendors and their providers, their equipment providers, and making sure that, all of these links in that chain are secure, you're going to ultimately be in trouble. You look at Target, for example, well know that, that attack came through, one of their vendor systems, and so it came in and became trusted, and all of a sudden they have a major problem. So if there's another takeaway for everybody here is you've got to make sure, and this is particularly important for lawyers because a lot of times we review contracts and kind of give an okay on them. You have to make sure that due diligence is done on your vendors to make sure that they, in fact, are securing their networks and their systems and their protocols in a way that's appropriate and necessary, ultimately to protect you and your enterprise.
And this came up in a recent meeting. I think it was in the context of the Target attack, and someone made the excellent point that, by the way, it's not going to be a valid defense if I'm sure Target had a flurry of lawsuits. It's not a valid defense to say, oh, it was the HVAC vendor that caused us to lose all your data or get your credit card information in the hands of the dark cloud or what have you. So
that's right.
Same goes for cloud service providers. That is not risk transference, right?
Right, true.
You're still the data owners, and a breach is just as capable of happening in the cloud, as we all know, as it is on-prem.
Right, and we don't know if it may not be to a cybersecurity attack, but Facebook's now having big problems. So it's not, the size of the company isn't necessarily a guarantee of that your data is going to be taken care of.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You know, big, small, and a lot of times companies have the mistaken impression that we're small, nobody's really going to go after us, but it's just not true anymore. And the other thing that I'll throw out there is, a lot of times now these attacks aren't, you know, the goal is to get in there and not be seen. You know, let's put ransomware aside for a second. The goal is not be seen and exfiltrate data out and just keep pulling it out. And so, you know, they're stealing data, particularly from small and mid-sized companies, because there's a perception, and maybe rightly or wrongly, that they are less protected than the big players. And so they're, you know, small and mid-sized businesses are particular targets. And so for us lawyers, you know, we have to kind of make sure that we are helping the company, our enterprises, to ask the right questions, to think about these things, to talk about these things, to communicate about these things, so that we can make our enterprises as resilient as possible on the front end. And then should something happen, you know, as able to recover as quickly and as efficiently as possible on the back end.
Well, one thing I'll just add about ransomware is that, you know, some companies feel that they're safe because they don't have the big crown jewels that are worth all this money, or they don't have tremendous amounts of data. But do they have money? I mean, ransomware is just all about money. And if they get money, then everybody's, you know, vulnerable.
Right. And it's interesting, and I'll just throw this last thing out. The Jackson County, the virus they're identifying is, I'm going to tear up the name, Ryuk, RYUK virus. And it's coming out of Eastern Europe, they think. But interestingly, for that particular variant, the average ransom is $384,000. You know, it's just more, you know, the perpetrators of that particular variant are just asking more in ransom. So, you know, yeah, to your point, you may think you don't have data, but could you function without your data on a day-to-day basis? Could you survive? Could you operate your enterprise? And if the answer is no, then you need to make sure as best you can that you're prepared and secure.
I think that's probably about all the time we have. Chris, would you?
Yeah,
concur?
I agree, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. We hope you all stay involved with this working group, and we do these calls every month. So we have a different topic each month, and we have several other working groups at In the House. I hope you will also consider becoming a member of In the House. The dues are very reasonable, just a few dollars per month. And you can join us at www.inthehouse.org. Click on join, and just takes about 30 seconds to sign up. So tell your other in-house friends and colleagues about the work we're doing, and get them involved. And I want to thank Roy Hadley Jr. and my co-chair of this group, David Heckler. Thanks for a really incredible discussion. We could only scratch the surface, but it was pretty exciting to talk to the guy who headed up the legal effort for the, I guess, the biggest ransomware attack in maybe municipal history, at least. And, you know, that was a very significant matter. And we'll all keep watching this space, and feel free to reach out to me again, Chris at inthehouse.org, with any questions, and hope to see you all next month.
Well, we'll just add one thing, that there's this long interview with Roy that will
Right.
be posted on the In the House page for this particular group. And if friends of yours are disappointed that they couldn't tune in for the live version of this conversation, that'll also be posted as both a video and an audio for future installments for people who couldn't make it today but want to see it later or
Great
hear it.
point. Great point. That will be
Thanks so
available
much,
hopefully
Roy.
tomorrow for everybody. So I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll see y'all next month.